All right.
Morning, Jody.
Oh, Jody, I think you're muted.
You're right, I am. I quickly had gotten a phone call from my daughter, so I muted myself. Forgot to unmute.
How's she doing?
Good. This is her last year, so she'll be done in May.
Is she doing an MDiv or an MA?
MDiv. Yeah.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
Will she come back this direction briefly, or would love to see her, see how she's doing?
Yeah. Actually, she's gonna do, well, she applied for it. We'll see if she gets it, but residency for hospital chaplaincy. She has an interest in doing mental health chaplaincy residency there. I don't know what she'll end up doing in the bigger picture, but it gives her another avenue of possibilities of
That's great.
doing ministry, but maybe in a different way.
She would be showing compassion.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's a great, thank you, Peggy. That's a great transition. I appreciate that. That was the question I'd asked everybody to consider, and then put you into groups. So what were some things that you came up with?
Confusion.
Confusion, why? What do you mean?
Well, we had all kinds of definitions and we were picking them apart, and we felt compassion maybe combines sympathy because you've had the similar experience. And Jean McDonald told us about a gentleman in Stillwater who was homeless, and now he is going to the homeless camps, and he's not homeless anymore, but he's bringing food and helping those people.
Okay, so stepping into someone's own struggles, probably maybe from a base of having had the same struggle, or at least having experienced difficulties. Okay, what were some of the other definitions? I'm interested to hear that you started picking apart.
I don't think that's sympathy, though. That's empathy.
Yeah,
He was feeling with those people.
Sally, I think you were gonna make a comment, but I think you're muted.
We talked about compassion, empathy, and pity.
Yeah.
We did
Really
too.
more than we did sympathy. It was more compassion, empathy, and pity.
And what's the pity element?
We
That
didn't
seems-
well, it came, if you look in the dictionary under compassion, you'll find the word pity. We didn't like the word pity. That feels very negative, where empathy and compassion feel empowering and positive.
Yeah, that seems, I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like sympathy and pity feel more like observer status,
Mhm.
Yeah.
whereas empathy and compassion feel more like engagement
But with
kind of
the
with.
the example that Diane just gave and that Jean gave, I thought she used the word empathy, not sympathy. But Diane had said that the situation was compassion with empathy, which was compassion with legs on it.
Yeah.
Oh,
And so we saw the empathy as more involvement, where compassion may be more, we didn't say this, I'm saying this, more a feeling, more an awareness, but maybe not with the legs on it.
I can have compassion for the people starving in Yemen, but I can't have empathy with them. Empathy is more one-to-one.
Well, and
Okay.
you can't,
Try that on.
Well, it'd be interesting to see what you think when we get to the little short passage where the word is used, because it kind of intersects with it. I would say in some ways it's almost the way that the word here is used is almost a synonym for empathy. At least
I
in
think
this scriptural
empathy
text.
and pity are the call to arms for compassion.
And
I mean,
compassion becomes the action.
Yep,
Yeah.
it is definitely a verb.
Yep.
You can't have compassion for the hungry in Yemen unless you send a check or or, you know, I don't know. But compassion to me requires an action.
Yeah, it's definitely a verb. That's right. Tom, it sounds like I
Yeah,
think you're gonna
yeah.
make a comment.
One of the things is, that we talked about was that pity had a element that you were up here and looking down on this poor person, whereas compassion was coming alongside.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Compassion's an emotion, not an action.
Actually, it's a verb.
Emotional verb.
Well, yeah, it's a verb indicating a doing of something. So it's more than just an emotion.
A feeling something.
I think it's more than just an emotion. At least the way it's often used. But yeah, I suppose it can be used that way. Elgin. Elgin, you're not supposed to use that. That's my generation's catchphrase, right? That's Gen X. We're the whatevers.
One of the things that there was the story about a little boy that had broken both his hands skiing, and later developed great compassion towards anybody that was also suffering.
So that captures, I think, what Elgin's also at, right? That's sort of a sort of outlook almost, but implying also an action. It sounds like. Diane, looked like I think you were going to make another comment.
Well, I was under the impression, and maybe I'm wrong, that the word sympathy means you have had the same experience. I could sympathize with someone who's lost their mother in death, and I can also have empathy, but sympathy means you've had a similar experience, whereas empathy doesn't need to have that definition.
I think it's just the opposite.
I think it's reversed.
Really?
Yeah.
So
I've been wrong all these years? Oh, darn.
Great empathy for you, Diane.
Emotional compassion, Elgin.
oh, this is great. Well, we're gonna move into then our discussion.
Yeah, let's go to the study.
Yeah, this is marvelous. This is great. So I'm gonna hit the mute button just so everybody knows. Okay, so if you remember, of course, when you want to unmute yourself, you can feel free to do that to make comments or ask questions. And I'm going to share my screen here. So this was our opening discussion, was what is compassion? Okay, so just to kind of remind ourselves where we are in our study of Luke. We're in chapter 6, and we're basically coming to the end of the Sermon on the Plain. So if you remember pretty much chapter, I think it's like 5 up through about 9 of Luke, takes place in Galilee. And so this is a kind of a remote area. If you came from Judea, you probably looked down on Galilee. We noted that Tom actually made a great observation a couple of weeks ago about the probable class difference that was also at play in the crowds that Jesus was talking to. Particularly when we get into chapter 6, that's when we sort of get Luke's rendition of what we all probably know as the Sermon on the Mount. But here it's been called the Sermon on the Plain, I should say, because Jesus comes down from a mountain and stands on a flat surface. Pretty much everything that appears here in this chapter, again, also appears in Matthew, but of course Matthew has a lot more. And the material that's in Matthew that's condensed in those 3 chapters, 5, 6, and 7, all that stuff also appears in Luke, but it kind of gets spread out a little bit more. So those are just reminders of where we are. So, and literally we pick up the story here pretty much at the very end. We've gotten the Beatitudes and the kind of the blessings and the woes That's one of the unique things actually about Luke's rendition, is that he also includes woes. And the basic idea, of course, is that that these are indicative, right? And so that means that they describe something essentially that God is about to do. And I think if we took all the blessings and the woes together, we would hear that God is about a great reversal, right? That God is coming into the world to kind of turn things upside down, in a sense, right? Those who are on the outside are going to be brought in, while those who are on the inside might wind up being on the outside, etc. And so then we transition out of those blessings and woes into the next section of Luke, where we get the essential charge. I think so this is where all the verbs become imperative verbs, which means that they're effectively commands. And these commands are to everyone, right? So whether you're an insider or an outsider, the idea is, in light of the coming reversal, this is how you should live. This is what will enable you to live. And what's the essence of that? That you be merciful as God is merciful. Right? That is the boiled down essence of that whole section. If you recall, we get an initial statement of, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, but then that is transcended about 5 verses later. And then we see kind of the essence really is learning how to do and to be merciful. So, and then sort of an elaboration, I suppose we could say, around that. So these verses then constitute effectively the conclusion of that sermon, and then we're going to shift into basically a different scene. So if I could have a volunteer who's willing to read our passage, that'd be great.
I can read it.
Great.
Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I tell you? I will show you what someone is like who comes to me, hears my words, and acts on them. That one is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood arose, the river burst against that house, but could not shake it, because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not act is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the river burst against it, immediately it fell, and great was the ruin of that house.
Okay, so kind of quite a way to conclude, right? Effectively, this teaching section that we've gotten here from Jesus. And that's the other thing, by the way. This is the last sort of overview question or comment, is that this really section constitutes the first time we really hear the teaching of Jesus, kind of in a straightforward fashion. So, and it's in a way, it's sort of an interesting thing that's going on here. It kind of makes sense to a certain extent, because this section starts, right, with Jesus choosing the 12, right, sort of picking out, and the implication is that there's a larger crowd of people who also understand themselves to be disciples. And remember, we had a conversation together about those two terms, disciple and apostle, one of them meaning to indicate someone who is a student or a follower. And we talked about that is a term that was used also in the rabbinic context. And so it's not all that unusual or unique. The other term, of course, was the apostle term. And both of these, by the way, of course, are terms that are applied to us, right? They are not terms that are just sequestered in the ancient world or that are only applied to characters in the Bible. They also apply to us. We are called to be followers, number one, and we are called to be sent, right? That's what apostle means, a sent one. So both of these things function. So we get to the end then of a teaching section, and this sort of makes sense, right? Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I do, right? So this would be the terminology here, Lord, Lord, is being used not so much in a divine sense as a kind of teaching, right? That this might have been a colloquialism for someone addressing their teacher, right? And so the question is pretty straightforward, right? If you call me your teacher and you don't do what I tell you to do, then I'm either not your teacher or you're not my student, or I suppose both. So that's a way I think of reading this. And then we get verses 47 through 49, which the imagery here is really striking. And I'd say the parable itself is actually pretty straightforward, right? So I'll just read this. I will show you what someone is like who comes to me, hears my words, and acts on them. That one is like a man building a house who dug deeply and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood arose, the river burst against that house, but could not shake it because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not act is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the river burst against it, immediately it fell, and great was the ruin of that house. Right. Straightforward, relatively straightforward parable. Would have probably been quite effective in a region that was not ignorant of flash flooding, right? So I mean, that's kind of the sort of the image here, right? Of building a house, and all of a sudden, you know, a kind of either a dry riverbed or a small stream becomes a torrential river, and it comes against the house, right? So the imagery would have worked. So, but what's the meaning? And I think here the meaning is what it sounds like in the straightforward sense, but there's also a couple of nuances I think that are helpful to think about. The first is this idea that started out the Sermon on the Plain, which is the idea that there is a reversal that's coming, right? That God is doing a new thing, right? In and through Jesus, right? I mean, he starts out with the proclamation of the year of Jubilee, caring for the poor, caring for the dispossessed. And then, of course, we get in the Beatitudes, right, the sense that that also implies a kind of reversal. And reversals, and here I think helping to think about the contextual background can be quite illuminating, because that would to me, at least, the most appropriate way is sort of a Jewish apocalyptic background. And remember, apocalyptic, this is a word that refers to a certain way of viewing the world and a certain types of texts, but having to do with the end of all things, right? The final day, you know, is upon us, God's day of redemption, but that's also, of course, a day of judgment. One of the things that's included in most apocalyptic sort of vision settings and texts is the idea of tribulation, right? That a period of apocalypse is going to be a period of tribulation. And the tribulation essentially is a kind of testing, is I think a way of thinking about this. So this imagery that Jesus is giving to us here really kind of lights up, in a sense, when we put it in that kind of eschatological framework, right? So as I say here on the screen, it says the eschatological reversal is not going to be smooth. It's going to be filled with dangers or tests, but how will you respond? Right? That's the question. And of course, the reason, and this is also an aside, but it gives you a reason for why people expected some kind of tribulation, was that the tribulations have a sort of purifying or testing kind of quality to them, right? So you go through these trials, in a sense, from this perspective, right, within this way of looking at the world, in order to show the quality of who you are, right? The quality of your discipleship. So what will enable you to stand, right? What will enable you to have a house that's firm in the light of the coming, you know, trouble? Well, it's doing what Jesus commanded you to do. And that's not just a vague thing, of course. Again, when we think back, what was the essence of the entire section, the imperatives? The essence was having mercy, right? Showing compassion, right? Which itself is, as we're going to find out, and we've already kind of found out in the narratives, but we really start to find out in these next two scenes, actually, is a transgressive compassion, right? It's more than willing to go beyond the boundaries of what is normal and certainly also what is acceptable, right? And I think what we get here particularly are two instances, one with a Gentile and the other with a dead body, right? And a woman, a widow, right? And so those are the fact that Jesus interacts with these things in the way that he does shows that God's mercy is not just a mercy that's extended for those who come to you. And it's not just a mercy that's sort of has to operate according to a certain kind of set of expectations of what's acceptable and not acceptable. It's rather something that can transcend that, right? That can go beyond that. So getting your house in order and helping it to stand on that foundation, right? That God is always about mercy. God is always about this compassionate love. That's what will enable you to stand. That was what will show the quality of your discipleship. And of course, I think we all know that's not necessarily easy to do, right? And it's not always straightforward. It's exactly what that's going to look like in every situation. And so this is, of course, why we need one another to continue to wrestle together and to discern the Spirit. The implication, of course, of this, there's a reverse side that those who do not commit themselves to that will be shown for who they actually are. It will be, the quality of their discipleship will also be unveiled. And the implication is, of course, that they are not good students. They are not good followers. They're effectively false disciples to a certain extent. That's sort of the imagery, at least, that is at play here. Let me stop for just 1 second before we move forward, because we're kind of, again, at the conclusion of the whole sermon. And we're going to shift into a different scene and see what kind of comments or questions anybody might have.
Christian?
Yeah.
Yeah, just foundations are very important, but also comparative between strong and weak. Very familiar teaching pattern. But also, one of the things that we came up with when we were talking about compassion was the verse from 2 Corinthians 5 here. It says, "For just as the Messiah's suffering overflowed into us, so through the Messiah, your encouragement also overflows. So if we undergo trials, it is for your encouragement and deliverance. And if we are encouraged, that should encourage you when you have endured sufferings like those we are experiencing. Moreover, our hope for you remains staunch, because we know that as you are sharing in the suffering, you will also share in the encouragement. That there's that the trials we go through kind of build up our effort to share compassion."
Yes.
And
it becomes sort of the bedrock in a way, right? Of compassion.
Yes, yeah. And it's related back to Christ. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Kristen, I think this also reminds us that Jesus says that being a disciple is a lot about action more than it is about belief.
Yeah.
The Christian church is split into umpty thousand denominations based mostly on little differences in belief, but Jesus keeps coming back to action.
Absolutely, Jeff. And actually, you are touching on something that's going to come up in this very next passage,
Okay.
which I think is you're totally correct. It's not just about it's not that belief is unimportant, I suppose, but that is not the essence, right? That's not the center, really. The center is as you said, about action, about putting these things into work, right? I was reminded from Jeff's comments actually in his sermon, right? It's not, he read that passage out of James. It's not enough to be hearers of the word. You also have to be doers, which is kind of a similar, I suppose, way of thinking about this. Great comment. Any other comments? Elgin, do you guys want to make a comment? No, okay, I couldn't tell. It looked like you were trying to unmute. Sue, did you have a comment?
Well, you know, I don't know if the compassion piece relates to the turn the other cheek. I always had trouble with that. You know, if someone hits you, you're supposed to turn the other cheek, almost inviting them to hit you again. I always found that was hard. But maybe there's a part of this that's saying, or could there be a part that's saying, try to understand what that action is all about, and then, you know, withhold your hate, you know, try to have understanding come in there, which to me, understanding also underscores compassion.
Mm.
And I don't know, I always had trouble with that turn the other cheek. It's like you're inviting someone to abuse you.
Yeah, I wonder. I agree, because we obviously don't want to think that that's what's at play here. I have thought. I'm not saying that this is, you know, be all end all or anything, but I have been thinking a little bit about particularly that passage, because we just kind of passed through some of that, I guess, last week.
Right.
But whether or not it's really a command to have at the top of your head, or at the top of your front of your mind, a sense of trying to stop the cycle of vengeance.
Oh, that's good.
You know, that could be that it doesn't mean you have to. I just feel like that puts it in a different light, sort of, somehow. You know, that it's not
makes better sense.
Yeah, but I don't know. I don't know if that's totally right, but I've been thinking about it that way, and I wonder if that's what's at issue, or that's the way.
I always think of that passage as don't hit back.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the essence, right, in some ways, is to precisely stop that cycle, because that's what we kind of see on certain level, you know, in the life of Jesus, in the story of God's love, right?
Yes.
The human beings doing wrong, and God not necessarily letting human beings get off the hook without, you know, acknowledging the wrong, but the cycle of vengeance is
Mhm.
constantly being stopped.
Which interrupts your energy, you know, so
Yeah.
your energy isn't into, ooh, what can I do to get back, but more, you know, how can I look at this in a different way?
And that is also very hard.
Mhm.
And I mean, I know for some of us, like, we're consciously wanting to get back, but I've also sometimes found that, like, it can become unconscious. You know, that like you're just frustrated about something and you can't put your finger on it, you know, but it was. So this is the kind of thing that has to sink in, probably, I suppose, deep, deep, deep.
Yeah.
All right, that's great. Let me move us forward then to our next set of verses. Let me see if I can get a volunteer. I think, Judy, you were willing to read the last one. Maybe you want to do this one? I don't think I can hear you.
There.
Okay.
After Jesus had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. A centurion there had a slave whom he valued highly and who was ill and close to death. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, asking him to come and heal his slave. When they came to Jesus, they appealed to him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy of having you do this for him, for he loves our people, and it is he who built our synagogue for us." And Jesus went with them. But when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore, I did not presume to come to you. But only speak the word and let my servant be healed. For I am also a man set under authority, with soldiers under me. And I say to one, go, and he goes. And to another, come, and he comes. And to my slave, do this, and the slave does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health.
Okay. All right. So pretty powerful little story here. And basically my comments here, first of all, just sort of because this story and the next story sort of fit together nicely. So 7:1 through 17. So just a couple of comments here. And in particular, I think the main thing is just to highlight the fact that these two stories are connected to an earlier passage, right? Where, if you remember, in back in chapter 4, where Jesus preaches his inaugural sermon, his opening sermon, with the quote from Isaiah. And, he's in the synagogue, he sits down, and in your hearing, this has been fulfilled or is being fulfilled. And then they get into, an argument, sort of, right? He kind of begins to expound on what it means. One of the things, of course, he says is, you will all say, why don't you do the things here that you did in Capernaum? So first of all, we have then a direct connection there. But we also have in this a connection of the two stories that Jesus sort of shares very briefly there, right? Regarding Gentile inclusion. And if you remember, I think one of the key things that's really important to Luke, like one of sort of his theological elements that kind of shapes his narrative telling of the life of Jesus, is that that the inclusion of the Gentiles was always a part of God's vision, and certainly was always a part of the ministry of Jesus. Right? That's a big overarching point that Luke wants to hit, not only in the Gospel of Luke, but also especially in Acts, right? Because these two things kind of hold together. So it kind of makes sense, right, that shows up a couple times. And so Jesus actually in the scene in his inaugural sermon talks about, Elijah and Elisha, right? Right. One of them having to do with going to a widow, right, who is an outsider. Elijah goes and she winds up surviving. Her son winds up living. And then, of course, Elisha winds up healing a leper who is also, again, an outsider. And so there's sort of a tie in here effectively in regards to that, because first of all, we're going to get a centurion, right, a Gentile centurion. And in one of the stories, the Elisha story, the person who's healed of leprosy is a foreign king. So now we're kind of getting someone who has, sort of somewhat a similar identity. And then the second story is going to be a widow who's lost a son. And that also has a deep parallel with the Elijah story, even though probably it doesn't really tell us if she's Jewish or not here. But we it's quite possible that she would have been. So let's kind of just unpack these verses. I'll kind of read through verses 1 through 5 here. So after Jesus had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. A centurion there had a slave whom he valued highly and who was ill and close to death. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to ask him, asking him to come and heal his slave. When they came to Jesus, they appealed to him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy of having you do this for him, for he loves our people, and it is he who built our synagogue for us." So we've already mentioned, there are just a couple of pieces here, obviously. We already have mentioned the Capernaum connection that links us back to Luke 4. And again, the Nazareth and Gentile inclusion component here. So number one, the centurion has two strikes against him, really, which is one of the things that makes this so remarkable, this story in a sense, because not only is he a Gentile, he's a soldier. I mean, he's basically a colonizer, effectively, right? So he represents a foreign power, which is oftentimes responsible for profound injustice and violence inflicted upon the people. All right. So he has this double whammy in terms of his identity, at least, in terms of these external elements. However, we find out that this is sort of a category that kind of eventually, I think, over time evolves. And particularly, you might have heard this in the context of the 20th century. He might be described also as a righteous Gentile, right? So he is clearly someone who is beloved and also loves the local Jewish community. He is one of the people who clearly gave the money to get the synagogue built. And it may be that he got permission for them to build their synagogue. We don't know exactly what that phrasing there means. It could probably be both of these. And I think then the third thing to note is that he does certainly seem to represent effectively what was considered the third category from a Jewish world view in the ancient world, which is you had Jews, you had Gentiles, and then you had this middle group that they often called God-fearers, right? And these were Gentiles who attended synagogue, who were observant of holidays and festivals, and probably were kosher in terms of their food, the dietary things like that, but they did not get circumcised. So more than likely, we should see this person more than likely, I think, in that middle category. And I think that, this could also be significant for Luke, because the earliest, I would suggest the earliest Gentiles who are in fact coming into the church, more than likely are out of that status, that God-fearer status. Otherwise, it just becomes difficult to understand the way that Paul was writing to Gentiles if they had zero background understanding, Jewish history or the Old Testament. And his constant allusions to those texts seems to suggest that these people had been exposed probably already in the context of a synagogue, even though they themselves had remained Gentile to a certain extent. So, is there a comment? I think I hear some folks in the background there. Oh, okay, thank you. Thanks, Sue. All right, so then moving on, verses 6 through 8, and then towards the end. Verse 6, and Jesus went with them, but when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to say to him, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you, but only speak the word and let my servant be healed. For I also am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and the slave does it. All right, now, I think this little section here is like a renovation of the mind. It's pretty remarkable, all right? And I was kind of thinking about how to sort of explain this, because there's so many different examples of how God's transgressive love works. And that's really kind of what's at stake here from my perspective, at least. So there are basically just two kind of points that I want to point out. So number one, if this guy is a Gentile, right, and a God-fearer, then he would know effectively that for Jesus to enter his house would render Jesus unclean. Okay, so that's point number one. And so he basically accepts that may be the case, and he sort of tries to adjust himself to the proper protocol. But he does so while at the same time not giving up the hope that God's mercy can still effect, right? Can still heal his servant, right? So he adjusts himself to the proper protocol, and yet he also nevertheless believes that God's love is still transgressive and that Jesus can heal, right, his servant. So it's these 2 points, right? So as I have here for you on the screen, right? The centurion would know that coming into a Gentile home would potentially render Jesus unclean. So he inserts himself into the proper protocol, but he doesn't give up the request, right? He doesn't give up the belief that God's mercy, which is given to Israel, is also meant for the rest of humanity, is also meant for a Gentile. And so the second point, right? He doesn't give up this hope that God's power, right, can cross over the boundaries of clean and unclean. And that's one of the things then that makes this story distinct from the second story, because in this story, I suppose there are different ways of thinking about this. In this story, there is an action in which Jesus is kind of going towards. He's the one who's initiating. He's the one effectively who's going to bring the power. But the Gentile also accepts that maybe he's not worthy, right? And he doesn't want to risk Jesus's own ritual cleanness, but that doesn't mean that God's mercy can't still extend. The second story, we're going to have Jesus actually touch a dead body, right? So you get all kinds of ways that God can transgress, I suppose, is the point. In this particular case, though, it has its own sort of remarkable element at play. All right, so then we find at the very end the astonishment of Jesus, right? Which is always a wonderful thing when you're reading these texts, because oftentimes Jesus is not at all astonished by people. He can read their minds. He knows what they're thinking. And so every now and then you get a story like this where Jesus himself is surprised in a sense. And I love this in part because this becomes a moment in a way in the narrative in which we see sort of the Spirit working through other people, even back towards Jesus, right? That Jesus, in a sense, also becomes kind of a student to a certain extent in that regard. So it's kind of an interesting element here. And I feel like that also is at work in a couple stories in Mark as well. So what do we have? We have then in verses 9 and 10, which conclude it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. All right. So what does this mean? I think this is precisely what, Jeff, you mentioned earlier, that this is not so much about belief, at least in terms of like right doctrine or something like that. It is rather the trust, right, and belief in the nature of who God is, that God is the God of compassion and mercy, right? And that compassion and mercy, that there is no boundary, that there is no box that it can be put in. There is no distinction of clean and unclean that it cannot transgress to render that boundary meaningless effectively, right? I mean, effectively, when God goes into an area that's unclean, all of a sudden it becomes clean. So the boundary itself doesn't matter. So this isn't just about belief in a kind of doctrinal sense, I would say. It is rather about the idea that the heart of God, it really is mercy. It is that action, that compassion. And I think here, this story, because it takes place in Capernaum, then it becomes this profound counter instance compared back to Nazareth, right? Remember at the end of the Nazareth sermon and the interchange between Jesus and the people, they're ready to throw him off a cliff. And here it's a very different, right? It's a very different, and why are they ready to throw him off the cliff? They're ready to throw him off the cliff because basically Jesus is saying that God's Jubilee and kingdom is coming not just for Israel, it's coming for all, right? It's coming to include and embrace all people. And so here then we see that extension and it sort of shines out in a way it makes it quite unique and I think quite profound. Let me stop there for just a second and see what kind of comments or questions folks might have.
Kristen, I'm drawn to by the thought that if this is the Luke that was connected with Paul, which is usually our assumption, Paul was always desiring not to have the Gentiles convert to Judaism, because really in a apostolic or kind of the end of the age picture that he sees in Isaiah of the nations coming to Jerusalem to worship.
Yeah.
Of bringing together both Israel and the nations. And if you make them all Israel, then you've kind of violated the prophecy.
Right. Yeah, that's great. That's a great amplification. I think that's absolutely right. And it also, this is also, I mean, it actually builds too on the sense of the integrity, right? That there is something important about their Gentile-ness, right? That also matters to God, right? They're the culture kind of vision. And it kind of fits in also, I think, with the Pentecost vision, right? Where they're not all talking the same language. You're right. It's not that everybody's given ears to hear some sort of single angelic voice or language. Rather, they hear God's word in all of their languages, right? And I think that, in a sense, is again an affirmation of the diversity, in a sense, and it becomes a profound kind of an interesting place to think about how God thinks about cultures. Right, that to be, and this would bring us then into kind of conversations about mission, and we've been doing this whole kind of history of congregationalism and stuff, and I talked a little bit about some of the early mission strategies where unfortunately they believed that you had to become Europeanized to become Christianized, and of course this kind of clearly is a sort of break against that idea. And I think most mission practices clearly come around to that vision as well. Other comments or thoughts or questions?
Christian, could you move your screen up a little bit? I can't get the last sentence there. The Nazareth crowded act. Oh, thank you.
Did that help?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
I don't know what I did. But I'm glad it helped.
It did help. I can read the last sentence. Yeah.
Okay, good. Very perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so I'm going to, unless there's any other comments, we'll move forward.
Just the other thing with Nazareth down here. And it said that, I remember it, whether it's in Luke or other texts where it says he didn't do a lot of healings there because of their lack of faith. And here we have faith being an element in this healing as well.
And astounding faith, right?
Yeah.
You know, so it's just such a marvelous, again, I've not seen this faith in all of Israel. What a great, you know. All right, so let's move ourselves forward. See if I can get a volunteer to read our next passage.
I'll read.
Okay.
Soon afterwards, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow. And with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably on his people." This word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country.
Okay. So we follow one extraordinary story with another, right? And now we get, again, as I said, these two that belong together very definitely. Just a couple of comments here. And of course, this is where we run across that word compassion, by the way. This is the one I had in mind. So I'll unpack that in just a sec. So let me just read these first couple of verses here. Soon afterwards, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow, and with her was a large crowd from the town. So there's a couple of things here to note, and some of these details that are given to us here transform this kind of even more. They amplify even more the significance of these characters, and therefore I think the action of Jesus towards them. So first 9, just so that you know, is about not too far. It's about 25 miles away from Capernaum. So that would have been a few days walk, I would imagine, or at least 2 days perhaps. So Jesus makes this journey. And that, by the way, is going to become a hallmark of this gospel once we get past chapter 9, where Jesus just basically goes on a massive journey up to Jerusalem. Some of the details in here I think are important. And number one, we have a dead man. He's the son of a woman who's a widow, right? And all of that together. So it's not, and so obviously there's going to be a profound, like losing a child would obviously have a profound emotional, it would just be devastating. I don't even know what the right words are, but it would be profoundly devastating, right? It would be the kind of thing that would destabilize your whole world, your personality, etc. But then you layer in her status. She's a widow, and probably, and this is her only son. So effectively, her weeping is not just because she's lost her son. It's because effectively she too now is probably going to face destitution, and her death will not be far away, right? Because to be a widow in that situation with no one effectively to care for you, that's what these details I think are meant to convey to us, right? So she herself is weeping about her own approaching death as well. So it's not just her son. It's the profound sort of social insecurity that she would have found, because women were especially vulnerable in the ancient world, and in particular, unmarried widows who had no children were even more so. So what does Jesus do? He has compassion on her, right? When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." All right. So here's where that compassion word came from. And it's, again, this is one of those places in the telling of the story that to me is an awful lot like the place where Jesus cries at Lazarus' tomb, right? So you get this emotional connection that's also clearly bound up with an action, right? And so I think this is, again, a striking element, and it really follows upon the heel of the other striking element that we just heard about in verses 9 and 10, where Jesus is surprised, So compassion. So here, I just wanted to kind of offer to you sort of a root, because compassion is a word that comes out of the Latin, and the original Latin meaning was co-suffering. So to have compassion is, in a sense, to enter into the suffering of someone else for the purpose, hopefully, of being able to relieve it, right? And so it does have that. It definitely has that emotional connection, but it also clearly is connected to an action of some type, right? And so the way I framed it here on your screen is, if we take seriously, in a sense, that Jesus has assessed the situation, that he knows these details that we're hearing about in verse 12, that he has seen the whole breadth of her situation, the loss of her son, and the fact that she herself is now going to be she's going to be put in a very precarious position. He's entering into her situation in order to hopefully relieve it, right? So that's where the effectively he's saying to her, "Do not weep," right? You do not have to enter into that. So what do we get? Why do we not have to enter into it? Because the life giver is here. So then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still, and he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother, right? It's astonishing if you think about it, but it's kind of like prosaic in a certain way, right? It's just a very flat-footed description. Jesus touches the bier, tells him to get up. The guy gets up and starts to talk. Then Jesus gives him to his mother, right? Not a lot of elaboration of detail, in a sense of like, all of a sudden the body trembled and, breath came back in. You don't get any of that. It's just a straightforward description. So a prosaic discussion, right? But it does have a similarity again to Lazarus' story, right? Where Jesus gives life to Lazarus. And of course, the stories that we've already mentioned in Elijah and Elisha, and particularly the Elijah one, where he resuscitates the young man who has died. What's the bigger implication, though? That this woman's her family and her life are now restored, right? She receives her son back, but she by so doing, she also receives back a future, right? And those were both of those things were stolen from her effectively, with the potential of her son's death. And so this Jubilee element here, right? Jubilee, release and reversal, right? Released from the power of death, and a reversal of a woman's status, right? No longer a widow, no longer an outsider, no longer someone's subject, now restored, right? So again, picking up on this theme that we've seen all along, particularly in the Gospel of Luke. So what happens? The people freak out, understandably, right? So starting in verse 16, fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, a great prophet has arisen among us, and God has looked favorably on his people. This word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. So just a couple of comments, right? A great prophet has arisen among us. This also, I think, is an allusion, by the way, to the very next section, where basically John is going to send people to Jesus and say, are you the one that we were supposed to expect, or is there someone else? The people are already convinced, right? They have understood, which is actually this is very interesting, right? Because one of the other things that we have found oftentimes in these Gospels, and I think this becomes a warning for people like myself and others, and anyone really who becomes deeply kind of devoted, that just because we are deeply devoted doesn't mean we always see the way that we're supposed to see, right? So the people here most likely are just common farmers, right? And folks who live off the land or whatnot. They see that a great prophet has come, and John himself is going to raise the question later on, are you really that one? So he's in the status of someone who should be in the know, but he's not. And then God has visited his people, right? And here again is this deep irony when we compare it back to Nazareth, and maybe when we compare it also to some of the static, I suppose we can say, resistance to who Jesus is, that we are starting to get already with the religious experts who have been watching Jesus do certain things, trying to catch him, waiting, is he going to heal on the Sabbath? Those kind of questions. Here we have two episodes that tell that people, that some people are hearing, right, and do understand. And again, the irony, as I say here, is very deep. All right, let me stop for a second, see if there are any comments on this particular little episode.
Hi, this is me.
Yeah, go ahead, Suzanne.
Okay, no, I love these stories, and I love that the person was healed. But the people who pray devotedly, who follow Jesus devotedly, and they pray for that, and their prayers are not answered. So I guess it's the compassion of the community around them that lifts them up, really. But I don't think it's quite so Pollyanna in real life, that every time you pray intensely, Jesus, it's healed, the child lives, or the spouse lives, and it doesn't always work that way in life. So maybe in Jesus' life it did, but in our real life here, it doesn't work so magically, I think. And anyway, it's just a little disconcerting. Oh, well, maybe he's all healed. Okay. But it doesn't always happen that way.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think those are wise words that we need to bring in to this, and to remember, the shadow side, I suppose, of a story like this, right? Which is why, I mean, I remember my mom dying. I didn't understand why she was deeply devoted. She was, constantly praying. People were praying around her. And I'm sure there are others, probably most of us on this screen have had either directly experienced something like this or know someone very close who's experienced something like it. So I think those are very good words. And so so maybe what we want to do then, as we think about this, is just think about it within sort of the narrative story of Jesus, right? That is trying to make a point on a certain level about Jesus. And that point really is that God loves all people, and that love extends in a profound way beyond any of the boundaries. And it's an attempt to include others, but it's not always going to end. In fact, I would say it ends somewhat rarely in this kind of thing. I'm not sure that I've ever heard of someone having an experience like this. Though there are, of course, people who have been sort of cured by certain things. Anyway, I'll stop talking because I feel like this is the kind of difficult place where everybody probably has a bruise of some type or a wound.
Well, I had a different perspective. Here is a woman walking in town with the people that are with her. We don't know if she prayed. We don't even know if she knew Jesus. Jesus came upon her and pronounces a miracle. And if I was that woman, I'd be in shock. And I don't know we don't know if she was Jewish or Gentile, but she was a woman who had lost everything. And so I'm just thinking, when Jesus came upon her, you wonder if she knew who he was when he got there. And he totally came into her life in a shocking way. And that happens to a lot of people. But I keep thinking there's 4 answers to prayer. Yes, no, wait, and you've got to be kidding. And I think this woman was saying, good gracious, look what just happened to me. And the people were amazed also. They had a fearful respect and they glorified God. I just think this whole situation was a shock to everybody.
I think that's also good words too. It is true that the woman does. I think we could probably operate under the assumption that this woman does not know Jesus, because we don't get any kind of a story like we got with the centurion, where the centurion did. And I think maybe that's the story that's the most appropriate place for us to think of Zan's comments too. And then this one does have a kind of like, God in a sense disrupts the situation that this woman has now been thrust into in a way that is profound. And that then would, I think, fit a little bit, at least, with what we heard at the beginning of chapter 6, right? That what God is about is this kind of renovation and reversal, right? That the status quo, in some sense, is unjust, and the ship needs to be righted, right? And so here you get a graphic example of that. So the healing is at the center, but it's also not the main point, in a sense. It's the restoration, perhaps, of the woman and the family as a whole, in a sense. Maybe that's a good way to think about that. And these are good comments. Other comments? I think we got a little bit of a discussion going here. So are there some other comments of folks that they want to bring in as well?
I have a comment. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Jean. And then Sue, you go after.
I was thinking about the woman and how, because she was a woman, her son owned the house and she would be out on the street. He could not own it. So she would lose the house. She would have nowhere to live.
That's right. That's right. I mean, her status with the loss of her only son and she being a widow, her status is now
zero.
Very precarious, and more than likely she would probably die on the streets.
I question the status thing because she has a whole crowd with her. I mean, the town isn't going to put her out on the street. I mean, that doesn't
Well,
make sense.
but she would have no legal standing by which to hold on. And so it could be that another relative from a different place could come and claim the house. I mean,
They wouldn't throw every widow out on the street. That
Yeah.
doesn't
They do.
sound like a society.
well, unfortunately, there are examples of that happening,
Mhm.
even in the ancient world. So,
Yeah.
You know, when I was in Africa over 20 years ago, one of the things that the women we met were concerned about was that if they became widows, the whole extended family would converge on their house and take everything they wanted. And that was a concern today, even today.
Mhm.
And so, you know, it's kind of hard to believe, and you don't exactly know what to offer as far as a solution, except they have to change the law.
and that's another graphic. Like, I wonder why the town is gathered with her.
You know,
That raises that question, I suppose. I hadn't even
Under her house.
Frank
hadn't
just
even thought about
pointed
that.
out that the crowd isn't with her, the crowd is with Jesus and his disciples.
Hmm.
Let's see, let me
Jesus
look
went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him.
Oh,
Yeah, so the buyers, right? Yeah, that's a thank you, Frank. That's a great point.
But
All
then
we have are basically bearers.
And also then it says, and with her was a large crowd from the town.
Oh,
we
I
got
see.
two
Okay, so
crowds.
there we go. All right,
We've
so we have
got
two
two
crowds.
crowds.
But didn't they always do that at a funeral? I mean, everybody would show up and,
Yeah, that was quite typical. And in fact, you might hire someone as a
right,
professional mourner.
right.
Yeah.
Then you turn around and go, maybe you go to her house while the professional mourner was with her.
Possible.
You know,
Sue, did you have a comment too?
Well, I've just always liked the comment that, the Lord can't always have miracles and bring people back from life, but he breathes life into us and he shows light through his teachings. And so somehow I think that needs to be woven in there, that by showing his example of compassion and caring, he's breathing life in a sense to us, into our lives.
Yeah, that's a great point. Actually, and that's something that I probably should have. I think I did mention this a couple of weeks ago, but maybe I should have reiterated it as we left the section. But we sort of, prior to chapter 6, have a series of episodes where Jesus is basically doing what he said he was going to do back in chapter 4, right? Which was heal, bring Jubilee, and basically extend God's compassion and mercy, right? And then we get, starting in chapter 6, the teaching. And I think the idea is that not only is Jesus himself a giver of life, his teaching gives life, right? If we follow it. And I think that's absolutely right. I think so these become, in a sense, episodes that illustrate what we are called into. Doesn't mean that miracles can't happen, but I think it is important for us to, and I think it's important for us to keep that in mind, in part because precisely of the underside of that, which I think is where Suzanne's comment was coming from, which I think is also important. If you pray and pray and pray and hope and hope and hope, and nothing happens, and you are working with the perspective that if you pray, that God will somehow answer it, then you could be profoundly disappointed. And that maybe the point is something different, right? Which in this case is, again, that kind of extension of compassion. All right, this is great. Let me, are you okay? Do you guys want to stop now, or do you want to do the last little snippet? We're right at 11:30. So we'll go ahead and stop.
Oh.
Was that a yes, no?
Mhm.
All
Yes.
right, let me,
Yes.
okay, so we got a yes. All right, very good. Okay. Well, I wish I'd gotten a little further, but we did get through a rich section here. We had a couple really great conversations, actually. Any concluding comments that folks are interested in making before we wrap up here?
Just
Not
The
gonna do
reason I
one,
really like Luke. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
okay. My thoughts were on David when his son died with Bathsheba. You know, he had prayed and fasted, and yet the child died. So just that the scripture also embraces that side of life as well. That it doesn't always work where the prayers are answered. Yeah.
One small reminder, kind of technical. We will have a session next week. I know next week is President's Day. Typically, we would not meet because the church building is closed. But obviously, we're Zoom together for the time being, at least. But I am going to take off the week after. So I just need a break, and I'm going to take off Sunday and Monday and kind of recharge a little bit as we head into Lent. So I will remind you of that. I'll send out an email, and we'll take a little momentary pause, and then we'll resume our study together. So let me conclude us with a brief word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for this day and for the chance that we have to study Scripture together. What a profound vision you put forward to us in Jesus. What a profound opportunity you give to us as people who are trying to follow Jesus, to be people of compassion, people of mercy and justice and humility. We pray, Lord, that that's what you enable us to do, that we use the life you've given us and the life you continue to give us to give life to others. We thank you for this day. I pray for my brothers and sisters as we go forth, that you will be with them and with all of us. In your name, amen.
Thank you.
Blessed